Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Now in the next few tutorials you may notice a slight difference. Now in this period of uncertainty, I don't have access to my normal recording or baking equipment because I'm also changing location. But don't worry, I've come up with a few back to basic recipes which involves no fancy equipment or ingredients. So I hope you enjoy these recipes, I hope you try them out, and most importantly, stay safe. So in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make Sablés Hollandais biscuits. They're basically fancy French shortbreads, but they're sandwiched vanilla and chocolate, and you can make some really nice patterns with it. So I'm going to go for a spiral. To start off, I'm going to sift my plain flour into a bowl. And using my normal cup trick, I'm going to sift it until all the larger lumps have sifted out and it's nice and fine. I'm then going to go in with my icing sugar and a pinch of salt. I'm not going to measure the salt, I'm just going to go straight in with it, and then sift that into the bowl as well with the flour. And then I'm going to take a de-scraper. Now a de-scraper you don't really need, but it does come in handy when you're making biscuits or pastry because it kind of cuts through flour, and I'm just using it to give the flour and sugar and salt a little bit of a mix. So now I'm going to go in with my butter. Now my butter is nice and cold like it would be for pastry. So it's just come out the fridge and I've cubed it up. And now I'm going to rub it in between my fingers and thumbs to make a sand-like consistency. So you can do this on a mixer with a beater attachment, but I actually quite like doing this by hand anyway. And it takes about 5 minutes for it to get to a really fine sand-like consistency. Once it's at this consistency, you can go in with your egg yolk. Now it's going to be a little bit sticky at first, so I'm going to use the de-scraper just to initially mix it through the flour. So once I can see that there's no egg yolk left, I like to transfer it and knead it together using my hands. Now it is a sticky dough, so I occasionally rub off the excess dough from my hands, but I'm basically kneading it together so it comes together as a dough. I'm then going to transfer it onto the surface and use the de-scraper just to get all those bits of remaining dough from the bowl and put it with the rest of the dough. And now I'm going to do a technique called phrasing the dough, using the heel of my hands and push the dough away from me onto the surface. Now this ensures all the dough and all the butter in the dough to be mixed in thoroughly. Now as I said, it is quite a sticky dough, so I'm going to use the scraper to scrape it off the table because it will keep sticking to it. But eventually it will all come together. I'm now going to divide the dough in half, just roughly, I'm not going to start weighing it, and put one of the halves to the side. I'm then going to get the cocoa powder and add it to the remaining half on the desk, and then fold the cocoa powder into the dough because I'm going to flavour this dough with chocolate. Now this can be a bit of a messy job, so I'm going to keep using the de-scraper and just bring the cocoa powder into the dough until it's fully mixed in. And eventually you get a really smooth chocolate biscuit dough. Now you might want to wash your hands before this bit just to keep things nice and clean, but we're going to cling film each piece of dough separately. And as always with any pastry or dough, you want to press it flat so the cold is distributed evenly in the dough. And then same with the plain piece of dough. And you can see that even though it's not exact, each piece of dough is pretty similar in size. Now that's quite important because we're going to match them up, so you want them as similar size as possible. Now these are going to go into the fridge for at least half an hour until they're nice and firm. Now the dough firms up really nicely, so I'm going to take it out the cling film and then squeeze it together to make sure that the cold is distributed evenly in the dough. So it will break a little bit, but just with a little bit of kneading and rolling on the surface, it does become pliable again. And you'll notice it's a really nice dough to work with, but it does get soft easily, so you do need to kind of keep that in mind. So I'm going to lightly flour the surface and on top of the dough, because like I said, it's a very sticky dough, and start rolling it out. Now I've got a rolling pin here, and I want to get a long rectangular shape. And I'm going to keep flipping and flouring just to make sure that the dough doesn't stick to the surface. Now I like rolling the dough directly on the surface rather than onto the baking sheet, but if you prefer doing that, then that's totally up to you. Just remember to keep it nice and floured so it doesn't stick. Now I'm trying to maintain this long rectangular shape, so I'm mainly doing forward and backwards motions. So I want to roll it to about 1/2 centimetre thick and make sure that it's nice and even throughout the whole dough. And once again, keep moving it around to make sure that it's not stuck to the surface. So now I'm going to transfer it onto some paper, and this can be a little bit fiddly, but it doesn't matter too much because you can correct it again once it's on the paper. So I'm just going to continue shaping it to maintain this long rectangular shape and put it to the side, and do the exact same thing with the chocolate dough. So squash it and knead it to make sure that the temperature is dispersed and to make sure that the dough is nice and pliable again in preparation for rolling it out. Flour the surface, flour the top. Now obviously with chocolate dough you can see the flour, but actually by the time it's rolled out into the right thickness, then the flour kind of goes and you can't see the flour anymore. So don't worry too much about that. It's more important that the dough doesn't stick to the surface rather than have flour on the dough, because you can always get rid of that after. So what I'm bearing in mind is I'm trying to achieve a similar shape to the plain dough before. So it's good to have the plain dough next to you so you can see how long you need to roll the chocolate dough out. Once again, transfer it onto the paper. I actually find the chocolate dough a little bit firmer than the vanilla, maybe because it's got the extra cocoa powder in, but I'm going to roughly make the same shape. So I've got some leftover egg white from cracking the yolks before, and I'm going to brush a thin layer of egg white onto the chocolate dough. And this is going to act as the glue to stick the plain dough to the chocolate dough. So carefully, I'm going to flip the plain dough onto the chocolate dough, and this is why the paper's important. And don't worry if it doesn't go perfectly, you can always press it down and give it another roll just to get rid of those air bubbles and make it as even as possible. So I've achieved this long rectangular shape with the dough, but I want to make it more exact. So I'm actually going to trim the edges and make a more precise rectangle. I'm also going to keep the excess dough, and you will see why in a minute. So it's obviously a combination of the plain dough and the chocolate dough, but don't worry about that. And you can see how soft the dough gets because I can literally squash that together and just leave that to the side. I'm now going to brush on another thin layer of egg white because we're going to start rolling this. And I actually like using the paper just to start the roll off. Make that first roll really nice and tight because you want to get a really tight spiral going. And then bit by bit, using the paper and kind of help the dough roll over itself and gradually roll the dough to make more of a spiral shape. And when you get to the end, you can see that we've got a nice spiral going. Once it's spiraled, you can kind of roll over it just to make it nice and tight. So you can see a really nice spiral formed, and now I'm going to just roll it back into the paper to keep its shape, and then that's going to go back in the freezer to make it really firm up because that dough's got really soft. Now with this excess dough, I'm just going to use the palm of my hand to mix it together and kind of get this lighter chocolate dough. And this is basically going to wrap around the log that we've just created to make sure that no dough goes to waste. So once again, I'm going to cling film this nice and flat and chill it in the fridge. So the excess dough has firmed up nicely, and so has the spiral dough as well, which is great because if that's too soft, this next part is going to be quite difficult. Now I'm going to actually roll the excess dough onto a bit of paper this time because I want to use the paper straight away, and you'll see why. So I'm going to roll this out into a smaller rectangle, basically keeping it as long as the spiral dough is because this is going to go around the spiral. Now this dough was actually very sticky, so there were points where I was kind of having to break it and mold it back into itself, but this bit doesn't have to be so perfect because you can kind of mold it around the spiral anyway. So I'm going to go over with a thin layer of egg white before placing the spiral of dough on top of it, and I'm going to encase the whole thing. Now I didn't actually roll out the dough wide enough, but I'm going to roll it backwards and forwards in the paper, and that will spread the dough out anyway. And then I'm going to take bits off the edge and kind of puzzle it all together just to give it a thin coating. Now I keep saying it's soft dough, so it's really pliable, so you can kind of play around with it. I find rolling it in the paper gives it a smoother finish. So I keep rolling it around until the whole spiral is covered in that new layer of the chocolate dough. So once you're happy with it, you can start cutting the biscuits. So I've got a nice sharp knife here and I'm going to cut each biscuit about 1 centimetre thick. And as you cut it, you can see that gorgeous spiral of the chocolate and plain dough. Now, I started to notice as I was cutting this, I was actually squashing the spiral, and you can kind of reshape it, but I think it's actually better to put it back in the freezer to firm up. So you can see how quickly this dough softens. Right, so this has been in the freezer for a further 10 minutes and you can see instantly how much nicer it cuts and it doesn't squash the dough. So I'm going to cut 1 centimetre slices, and this is probably the most satisfying part of making these biscuits, seeing that spiral on the inside. So I was really happy the way that these turned out. So I've got a baking tray here lined with some baking paper. I've set the oven at 180 degrees Celsius ready to bake, and because these biscuits are firm from the freezer, I don't need to worry about refrigerating them before I cook them, but if they have softened up then you can put them back in the fridge, and they cook for around 10 to 12 minutes. So after about 10 to 12 minutes in the oven, the plain dough in the spiral starts to turn a little bit golden brown, and that is when they've cooked. So you leave them to cool completely before you can handle them. As always with biscuits, you need to wait for them to cool. Then you can display them nicely or enjoy them while they're still a little bit warm. So these are probably the fanciest looking shortbread that you've ever seen, but as you've seen from this tutorial, I didn't use any crazy equipment or any particular ingredients. This is literally just normal ingredients, just applying them in a different way, and you get these beautiful spiral biscuits, which of course taste absolutely delicious too. So give them a go and don't be scared. You can add some zest in if you want some different flavors like orange, that's also delicious. So try them out. If you do, as usual, please tag me at George's Cakes. More recipes on the way, and hope you enjoyed it. I will see you very soon.